Opium, the notorious narcotic that brought the mighty 5,000-year-old Chinese empire to its knees and turned a once proud and mighty warrior race into the sick man of Asia, defanged and declawed by the drug's debilitating effects on the human body. It could very well be said that the first major war on drugs in the modern world took place not in the ghettos of Harlem, but on the lawless streets of Shanghai and Hong Kong, where opium dens began cropping up like mushrooms throughout the early 19th century. While we normally associate opium with working-class Chinese men and women, the drug did not even originate in China in the first place. Opium, in fact, is produced from poppy seeds, which could only be found in climates such as that of India and Afghanistan. By the late 18th century, the British East India Company had established a monopoly on poppy cultivation in India. The Chinese had been using opium since the Tang dynasty, which they acquired from Middle Eastern merchants, but only for medicinal purposes, of course, and in very, very controlled doses. Throughout the late 17th century, however, things began taking a turn for the worse when people started smoking the drug for recreation. The British took advantage of this fact, seeing it as an opportunity to bring the mighty man of Asia to its knees, not through guns and bayonets, but through pipes and poppy seeds. They would get rich by marketing the drug to the Chinese by hook or by crook. If they could not get their hands on the beautiful silk and wonderful party drug known as Chinese tea, the legal way, they would do it the illegal way. By the early 18th century, opium had become such an alarming social problem. Levels of opium addiction had grown so high that it was beginning to affect the performance of the Chinese army and the official classes. Taken in excess, the drug had fatal consequences. The mother of the last Chinese emperor, Puyi, in fact, died at the tender age of 36 after an opium overdose. In 1729, of course, the Chinese emperor prohibited the sale and distribution of opium to laymen. And in 1796, it was officially banned. But this did little to deter the sale and distribution of the drug by British drug cartels. It didn't do much in order to discourage people from selling the drug, even if the drug had been made illegal. The amount of opium imported into China increased from 200 chests annually in 1729 to approximately 1,000 chests per year in 1767, and then to about 10,000 per year between 1820 and 1830. The weight of each chest varied somewhat, depending on its point of origin, but averaged approximately 140 pounds, which is about 63 kilos. By 1838, the amount had grown to some 40,000 chests imported into China annually, enough to kill the entire Chinese population several times over. The balance of payments for the first time in a long time, in fact, for the first time in human history, began to run against China and in favor of Britain. Meanwhile, a network of opium distribution had formed throughout China, often with the connivance of corrupt Chinese officials. You know, the Uncle Chans. Meanwhile, the British bourgeois was getting filthy rich, and Britain was fast attaining first world status through the exportation of misery abroad, while China, the world's former economic juggernaut, was plummeting into rapid decline. getting carved up like a turkey by the Western powers, including Japan, which is basically the Uncle Chan of all Asian nations. Fuck Japan. A Chinese official named Lin Zexu wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, imploring her to ban the sale and distribution of this illicit drug, a letter which of course fell on deaf ears. By the end of the Second Opium War in 1860, the nation of China had been wrecked by both Qing dynasty incompetence, as well as brute British strong-arming, which also resulted in the island of Hong Kong being wrested out of China's hands for British use. Thus began the quote-unquote century of humiliation. Had the Opium Wars not taken place, I might still be living in China today, in fact. My ancestors had to move. They had to move to the Malay Peninsula out of economic necessity. The cupboards were bare, the country was in tatters, and they had mouths to feed. We placed the limelight on the British Empire and their gang of Western thugs for the illicit sale and exportation of this nefarious drug, as we should. Great Britain, no doubt, has a ton of blood on its hands, and Queen Elizabeth has a ton to answer for in the next life for the sins of her ancestors and their cronies. But one factor we often overlook in the equation is the local Asian bourgeoisie who were more than willing to collaborate with the British drug dealers as their local trading partners, since they were the ones who spoke the lingo of the land, and they were the ones who had contact with local people. At the peak of the opium trade in the Malay Peninsula, local Asian businessmen such as Lok Yew, Manasseh Meyer, Wei Kei Siang, Shi Sui Cheng, Sultan Abu Bakar of Johor, and even, yes, Yap Aloy, the Chinese Capitan or community leader of Kuala Lumpur, were all doing very well for themselves from the sale and distribution of opium targeted at the local Chinese working class. Of course, none of these men were opium addicts themselves, just like the Scottish grocer Johnny Walker was a teetotaler, despite being a liquor seller himself. But surely these men, these wealthy Asian men who were happy to sell the drug, knew of the immense suffering of their fellow Asian people they had a direct part in, did they not? Did that necessarily make them evil men? Not necessarily. In case any of the descendants of these men comes across this video, please be assured that the purpose of this video is not to denigrate or debate the moral character of these men. We're talking about a system, not individuals. By all accounts, these men were generous philanthropists who contributed greatly to charitable causes and the advancement of their community. Lok Yew, for example, was an extremely generous donor to local charities. Yap Aloy built the first school of Kuala Lumpur, and he developed the city from a city of mud huts and, bamboo, rattan houses, basically into a modern brick and mortar city. We are not doubting their contributions to the development of the city and the welfare of the people. Even if their money was money attained through questionable means, they at least did put their profits to good use through the promotion of education and public welfare. Well, you can think of it this way. A liquor merchant knows full well that his business directly causes harm to the community. Alcoholism causes dangerous and reckless behavior, breaks up families, and leads to domestic abuse in many cases. Yet at the same time, the liquor man does not consider himself to be an immoral man. After all, he is simply answering a demand for the drug. He doesn't force you to buy the drug by any means. You are free to patronize his establishment or to boycott him. He is not the root cause of the problem, but simply a symptom of it. In the same way, these opportunistic local Asian bourgeois businessmen cannot be said to be the root cause of the problem, but a symptom of it. You see, the free market is neither moral nor immoral, but rather it is amoral. Nothing is sacred and everything is permitted. I wonder if you got this video game reference. Did you get the video game reference? The bottom line at the end of the day is profit. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, as long as you're making a profit, you can do whatever you like. If being moral is what leads to more profit, then you should be moral. But if temporarily suspending your morality leads to more profit, you also have to play by the rules of the system, right? So you can see why ruthless, dark triad psychopaths like Patrick Bateman or antisocial douchebags like Don Draper would thrive in such a system, as they literally have no qualms about killing you to line their pockets if they can get away with it. You know, like Don Draper said, you're born alone and you die alone. And the world just makes a set of rules and throws them on you, right? So, but even if you aren't necessarily an immoral man, you may very well end up getting influenced by the system to temporarily suspend your principles for profit. The free market gives ordinarily decent people plausible deniability to do awful things and sleep peacefully at night. Willing buyer, willing seller, after all. But as I've said, none of the local Asian bourgeois were dependent on opium, which was a drug used by the poor and downtrodden to relieve their woes and forget about their troubles temporarily. Now you have to remember that while the Chinese bourgeois were wining and dining with their British colonial overlords, wearing fancy Western clothes and basically living the high life, the Chinese laborer class, the proletariat, were often exploited. They worked long hours for meager wages. And like many of the Nepalese or Bangladeshi workers coming to Malaysia or Singapore today, lived in cramped and dilapidated conditions. Their life was hard. Their lives were hard. And thus they depended on the drug for escapism from the harsh reality of their lives. You could say that the vicious cycle of poverty and drug abuse go hand in hand. The exploited class depended on opium as a cheap form of escapism from their miserable lives, while the exploiting class sells the drug to them in order to answer their demand for it, which was caused by the exploiting class in the first place. Does that make sense? In the end, though, it is always the proletariat who pay the price for the sins of the bourgeois, or if not sins, the mistakes of the bourgeois. Why do you think we hang drug mules like Nagin, and yet we allow the kingpins, their bosses, to walk free? Why is a poor person who consumes alcohol seen as a worthless drunk, but a rich man who sells alcohol seen as a respectable member of society? I think these are questions worth pondering on. Now, in any case, I would like to end this video by saying that capitalism and imperialism go together like a horse and carriage. You simply can't have one without the other. Considering that man's wants under capitalism are infinite, while a nation's resources are most certainly finite, it's only a matter of time before the oligarchs of said nation start pivoting abroad to exploit other weaker nations in order to fulfill their material lusts. We've seen it with the white man's burden. We've seen it with sanctions and sweatshops, with wealthy countries going all out to keep poor countries of quote unquote lesser peoples, and I mean lesser races, poor and underdeveloped. Capitalism is a form of realpolitik that is so deadly because it seems so innocuous, so most people don't see it as a threat, unlike Nazism or fascism, which are explicitly dangerous. But make no mistake, free market capitalism has caused unprecedented destruction, misery, and catastrophe throughout the world due to its primary goal of individual profit at the cost of the collective. It is neither sustainable nor practical for the environmental preservation or maintaining good international relations. Either we end it or it will end us.